When Christ changed bread and wine into his body and blood at the Last Supper, he instituted the Eucharist and established the central act of Christian worship. At every Mass, medieval Christians participated in the reenactment of the Last Supper and in the commemoration of Christ's sacrificial death on the cross. At the heart of every Mass was the Eucharist, the consecration of the bread and the wine. In 1215, the Church's Fourth Lateran Council, after years of theological debate, codified transubstantiation. By that it was meant that at Mass, the substances of the bread and wine are changed into the actual substance of the body and blood of Christ. At the same time, in the 13th century, a new liturgical practice entered the Mass, the elevation. Following the consecration of the bread, the priest would raise the wafer high over his head for the entire congregation to see. These changes focused people's attention on the Eucharistic wafer, an otherwise small, thin, wheaten disc. The 13th century also gave birth to Eucharistic miracles, hosts that bled. This blood was interpreted as a literal sign of Christ's true presence in the Eucharist. And one of the most arresting of all of these miraculous hosts was the sacred bleeding host of Dijon. This image of the sacred bleeding host of Dijon is amongst the earliest known. It was added on a blank page in this book of hours around 1475. It is embossed with an image of Christ as judge, seated on a rainbow and surrounded by the instruments of his passion. The host bleeds at all the right places: at Christ's hands, at his feet, at his sides, at the crown of thorns. It was in 1433 that Pope Eugenius IV gave as a gift to Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy the miraculous bleeding host. It had been a treasure of the Vatican. Philip so valued this gift that he installed it in the chapel adjacent to his ducal palace in downtown Dijon in 1434, and he renamed the chapel the Sainte-Chapelle, or Holy Chapel, because it now contained a relic from Christ's Passion, his blood. This image is literally a souvenir. When one visited the sacred bleeding host in the Sainte-Chapelle in Dijon, one had the opportunity of going to the cloister, and there, for sale, were images of the sacred bleeding host that one could take home and paste or sew into one's prayer books. Notice at the top the gold crown. That represents the coronation crown that King Louis XII had given to the host in thanksgiving for the restoration of his health after he had been cured from a nearly lethal illness after praying to the sacred bleeding host of Dijon. Below the crown, on a scroll, you can read the beginning of the host's favorite prayer, O Salutaris Hostia. This cutting is one of 3 surviving from a grand choir book commissioned by the priests of the Sainte-Chapelle for their use in the chapel itself. At the left, you can see one of those priests who contributed to the commission. At the center, you can see the sacred bleeding host of Dijon ensconced in a grand monstrance. This large gold towering monstrance had been the gift to the Sainte-Chapelle by Isabel of Portugal, the wife of Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy, in 1454. The image itself is housed within an initial C, and it begins the introit for the feast of Corpus Christi. Cibavit eos ad adipe frumenti. He fed them with the fat of the wheat. When this couple visited the host, they commemorated their visit by commissioning this image that included their portraits adoring the sacred bleeding host of Dijon. They had the vellum sheets inserted into the back of their printed book of hours. I mentioned earlier that King Louis XII of France had been cured in 1505 after praying to the sacred bleeding host of Dijon. He attributed the restoration of his health to the host specifically. The cult of the host spread from Dijon to Paris, as can be seen in this printed book of hours that was published in Paris around 1523. The printer included the 4 quatrains that tell the story of the host. The first quatrain reads, "A Jew of yore, mutilating the host of the Blessed Sacrament by hitting it more than 10 times, caused abundant blood to flow." Medieval Christians believed that host miracles that bled did so as a result of desecration by the hands of Jews. The miniature of the host, as you can see, does not, however, depict Christ as a judge, but a crucifixion. The artist to whom the printer asked to paint this image had never been to Dijon. He didn't know what the host looked like, and he painted the wrong picture. Most of what we know about the Dijon host comes from this book. Philibert Boulier's 17th century monograph, Remarks, Historic and Christian, on the Holy and Miraculous Host. The physical survival of the Dijon host, for over 350 years, was itself considered a miracle, because hosts, wafer thin, normally crumble into dust over time. This 1753 book contains possibly the last known image of the host. French revolutionaries publicly burned it in 1794. In the 19th century, Micrococcus prodigiosus was identified. Growing on bread, this microscopic organism, which turns red and liquefies, is believed to cause the blood that appears on miraculous wafers. In 1825, a Mass of reparation was established in Dijon, celebrated annually on February 10th, the anniversary of the host's destruction. The Mass is still said to this day.